Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. We're doing some ancient history today and we get to have fun. Why do we get to have fun, Matt?
We do because we are joined by journalist and writer Elodie Harper, who's going to talk to us about her debut historical novel, The Wolf Den, which is all taking place in Pompeii. Hello, Elodie. How are you?
Hi, nice to see you both.
Oh, this is brilliant. So first of all, you've done novels before, but not. Why did you suddenly want to do a historical novel?
I've actually always wanted to do a historical novel. So my first novel was really a ghost story, which I repackaged as a crime novel and then wrote another crime novel. And that kind of fits with my role as a journalist. I cover a lot of crime, and history's always been what I love outside of my working life. And I wanted to do that instead, really.
And this is one book in a set of three, isn't it? What inspired you to pick Pompeii? And I'm having a thing at the moment about how I am talking up historical fiction when it gets to cover things that historians won't ever get to because the evidence just isn't there. And sometimes we have to rely on the creative. And your setting is a brothel, which we're not going to find the diary of a woman in a Pompeii brothel. I wish we would find it scratched on a tablet somewhere, but it's not going to happen. So what led you down these paths?
That's really interesting. I mean, we have got the graffiti, which I'll come on to in a minute, because we do get some impression of the women from that. I've always loved the classical world. So part of my English degree, I did Latin literature in the original. So particularly, the Latin side of things rather than the Greek has been a big interest of mine. And I absolutely love novels that reimagine the ancient world and women's role in it, because women are often quite integral players in ancient myth, but they're imagined from such a masculine perspective in the old stories. And obviously, now there's more of a trend from imagining it from the woman's point of view. And for me, I wanted to go even beyond myth and look at how women actually lived. And obviously Pompeii, I know it's famous for the volcano, but that wasn't really what interested me. What interests me about Pompeii is we've got such a wealth, a massive amount of material on how people lived, not just how they died. Their lives, the kind of minutiae of people's lives, the makeup sets that have survived, the frescoes that show how people dressed, the stories that they told. And the brothel, which you mentioned, is the most famous sort of landmark really on the tourist trail through Pompeii. And that itself it's been seen in a very particular way, in a kind of bit of a nudge, wink, wink, sleazy, titillating way. Because it's got these erotic frescoes. It's a very evocative space. It's survived, in an extraordinary state of preservation, really. So it is very famous, but it's not looked at from the women's point of view. These were real people. They lived real lives. Sort of sexual exploitation has been such a massive part of women's lives through history, and it's not often looked at from the point of view of how people got on with their lives kind of around that. And in terms of the evidence that's left behind, yes, we've got the erotic frescoes, which are obviously very objectifying, but we've also got some graffiti in the brothel that gives us the names of some of the women and occasionally glimpses potentially of personality too. There's one woman, Victoria, who becomes a character in my book, who refers to herself as the conqueress. So Victoria Victrix on the walls. And she sort of refers to herself multiple times in this way. So that kind of is a vague hint. And then there's also drawings that I imagine the women rather than the customers did. Of course, we can't know this for sure, like a bird, a ship, a face, just a real sense of them as people rather than as objects to be lusted over, both at the time they were alive and subsequently, as kind of, this nudge, wink, wink thing going on.
It must have been a lot of fun taking that research and then expanding on it in your imagination to create the novel. How was your process around that? These sort of little glimpses into these women that you were able then to expand on.
The research process was really fascinating. And it's quite a difficult balance because on the one hand, you don't want to be too bleak and grim and awful about it. I mean, who wants to write that and who wants to read it? So it was a real balance between looking at the sort of hard reality of what the women's lives were likely to have been. And I couldn't go to the really bleakest point, to be honest. I mean, there are various theories about how that brothel operated, whether it was on a freelance basis where women would kind of rent the rooms out, whether they were almost all certainly enslaved, or whether it was a sort of set group of women, which is the road I went down, who were run by a particular pimp on site. In reality, they probably were just stuck in the cells. But I just couldn't write a book like that. I mean, how grim would that be? So I had them going out for business, meeting people, so that they had freer lives than they probably would have done in reality. And in terms of how I did the research, I mean, there's some amazing books on Pompeii out there, Mary Beard's Pompeii being an obvious example. And there's also just so much visual material. So all the frescoes, the sense you get women from that, you know, not just in the brothel, but, you know, all over the walls of Pompeii. They're now mainly in the Naples Museum. So I guess that was my starting point, and spending time in the building itself, getting a real sense of what the place was like, what it might have been like to have had to live and work there.
It's so interesting. There is so much, like you say, about Pompeii. Did you, what other aspects of life in Pompeii have you brought in, and other jobs and other people? Because you must have been able to dip into, because obviously you've got to build the world around them. So who else made it into the book other than prostitutes and brothels?
Yeah, so the brothel's really the starting point, and then, you know, it's not going to be a whole trilogy in a brothel. So that's where the main character starts out. So initially on her sort of journey in the book, it's, you know, people who are similarly quite low down the scale. So there's like the local pub where they almost certainly would have all gone and hung out or have been familiar to them. So the characters working there, and there are all those amazing excavations and discoveries of the fast food bars and taverns in Pompeii. There's that recent one, the bright yellow painting of the bar and the frescoes. And so there's that aspect of life, the kind of fast food, almost cafe culture that they had, because most people didn't cook at home. They would have eaten out on sort of street food. So there's that aspect. There's the women that they would have met in the baths, at the public baths, so women from all different sorts of walks of life that they would have bumped into. And then later, as Amara, the central character, she's very ambitious to get out of the brothel, you know, meeting men from a higher standard of life. I kind of married two slightly unlikely aspects of a prostitute's life in that time. So I had her, she eventually manages to be hired out to give musical entertainment at parties, which is certainly something that women did at that time who were also used as prostitutes. I use the word prostitute because the women would have been enslaved, so sex workers kind of implies an agency that they wouldn't have had. So that then let me go into a slightly higher strata of life. And in doing that, you know, a lot of the inspiration is from Latin literature. So reading accounts of, you know, other accounts than just Pompeii based, I guess, you know, sort of across that period when I'm writing the 70s AD. So I took the text, the Satyricon by Petronius, and he writes a very, very famous banquet scene, Trimalchio's Feast. And in that, the satire is against the guy throwing the banquet, Trimalchio. You know, he's a freedman, he's kind of scoffed at. But I really wanted in this book to look at it from the enslaved perspective rather than how we normally have in Latin literature, a very sort of top-down view. So I reversed that as to what would happen if, in fact, the freedman wasn't the figure of fun, but the people laughing at him at his banquet are actually more the targets of satire for us now than he is. So, yeah.
So does, I suppose, taking that and twisting it around by focusing on the women of the brothel, that gives you a way into that sort of bottom up stratas. You can enter into so many places that maybe perhaps the social norms would have kept your characters away from.
There's definitely that. And it's also just, I feel it's such a huge, huge part of Roman history. You know, the empire was only able to run on enslaved labour, and the way that enslaved labour was embedded in every single part of society, right from, you know, the worst kind of life as an enslaved person in the mines or clearing out the sewage or whatever, all the way up to enslaved people who had quite high status as secretaries or courtesans. It just really mattered to me of wanting to sort of think as deeply as I could about what that meant for human relationships in that period when so many people were enslaved. And there's a fascinating book by Robert Knapp called Invisible Romans. He's a historian. And he talks about something called the mind world of a slave, and trying to go and look at historical artifacts or texts that are not written about slaves, but have some sense of expressing how they looked at life. So things like tombs that were made, thinking about the fact, you know, the type of family arrangements that people could have. And I think one of the really major aspects of life that I found both appalling and quite fascinating was the extent to which sexual exploitation was not restricted to prostitutes at all. Like, anyone who was enslaved was vulnerable to being used that way, including men. So in fact, you know, a lot of men suffered from this as well, because I came at it initially from this very sort of feminist, female driven perspective. That then when you read about the brothel, why there are no scenes of gay lovers on the walls, and a suggestion is because for men who used that brothel, who would generally have been very lower class, either enslaved or quite low down the pile, because higher class men wouldn't have gone to the town brothel. You know, the reason why there aren't scenes of men with men is that would probably have been quite triggering for a lot of the customers, who would have been reminded of their own abuse. So looking at a society in which abuse was kind of endemic and accepted, but at the same time hated by the people who were on the receiving end of it, I thought was quite an interesting thing to think about.
You've kind of covered a little bit of this already, but you've mentioned slavery, and it is heavily tied in with slavery, the idea of prostitution and brothels. Like you say, there's no agency to the girls working there. It's something that you have very little evidence for from their perspective. So how did you overcome that lack of source material?
So there is some kind of evidence, as I say, in the writing. So normally it is, you know, sort of the slave owning class writing about enslaved people, but sometimes they do so more sympathetically. So Seneca, for instance, in his letters, writes about the type of stuff that happened to slaves. So, you know, you might be used as a human napkin at the table. People would literally wipe their hands on their clothes to clean their hands. He talks, in fact, about the abuse of male slaves, how, you know, for the Romans to be used, the person, male or female, who was used by the other was kind of considered degraded, so, or humiliated, I guess, rather than degraded. So there's that aspect. You've also got, you know, very famous slaves who became freedmen, like Cicero's slave Tiro, you know, very educated people who, it kind of blurs into being part of the family, but of course you're not part of the family. But I found that interesting as well, and actually not perhaps as different as we like to imagine, because part of it is the economic imbalance and the power imbalance. So I think we can relate to that.
I think there's also as well, if you tie it in with, we would see it as a Roman doesn't do me time, do they? Privacy is a very alien concept in ancient Rome. I mean, you would expect to be going to the toilet and having a slave wandering around in the bathroom, or you would expect to be surrounded by you. The idea of having a room to yourself isn't something they do, is it?
No, that's very much the case. But something that they did value, and what marked freed people out from enslaved, was bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
So capital punishment, you couldn't, you know, that's not allowed for a Roman citizen. But I think the bodily autonomy aspect is in a way the hardest to get your head around when thinking about what it might have been like to be an enslaved person, that you literally didn't own yourself. You couldn't object to however you were treated, really. So, I mean, I think there is a lot of evidence of how people were treated. There is slightly less, there is less evidence about what they actually thought. But, some of the dedications that freed people left, or their writings, from that you can look backwards to what their lives were like when they were enslaved. And the fact that people still had very close family bonds, you can see from their tomb inscriptions. People within the enslaved community would have cared a lot about each other. They would have been able to get married, but it wouldn't have been legally binding, and so they could have been separated, and that's a kind of whole other horror that I don't go into in book 1. So yes, not sort of, there's no slave memoir that we can read, but there is quite a lot of evidence of that you can then build around to then put yourself.
Yeah. And this is the beauty of historical fiction as well, is that you don't need to prove it. You're creating an imagining of it. You're not a historian who has to cite every source. You can use it as inspiration, if you like.
Yes, exactly. And there is evidence that, enslaved peoples longed to be free. And certainly writing about women, that was the road I went to as my central character's motivation, because I didn't want to be anachronistic and make her a massive feminist, because there wasn't a kind of systemic argument for ending patriarchy or anything under the Roman Empire. But, it was common for slaves to fight very hard and to be ambitious to be freed. So that was her motivation for getting out of the brothel and for, to become free. So that was how I had the main character arc's journey.
So your main character's name is?
Amara.
Is she real, or did you sort of build her out of a few, the name real, did you build her out of a few different stories that you picked?
So I didn't use the main character's name as one of the real women from the brothel. So Victoria, Cressa and Berenice are all names written in the brothel walls, so they were real women. Amara, her name in Latin is halfway between love and bitterness, and she's a Greek character, and it is a Greek name. It's not a common Greek name, but it fitted in with the character's personality. She's named by her owner. That's not her real name. Her real name is Timorete, which is her Greek name. She's based, really, she's an absolutely fictional character. We do have women that rose from being courtesans to becoming quite powerful, and freed women who, went on to hold positions of, if not power, certainly they could be wealthy. And in this period, that was becoming more and more the case, that courtesans in particular, not brothel prostitutes, but if you managed to get on a trajectory where you were a more high-class form of prostitute, then we do have evidence of these women, that they were quite influential. They could be educated. They could be, valued for more than just being sex objects.
I'm just intrigued by your process for building your characters, and how many different elements creates your core cast. Is it you mentioned the three women whose names are recorded?
And the pub as well.
Yeah. Do you just sort of start taking a name and then just sit down with a cup of tea and just start imagining what this person would be, or do you start drawing from lots of different other sources to bring it together? I just find all that process fascinating.
He's a complete nerd who does like nuts and screws on aeroplanes, so like imagination is an alien concept about sometimes.
I like imagination. I'd like to have one time.
Well, it was a real range of stuff. So Victoria, she's kind of based on the graffiti that we have in the brothel. Amara was, very much a fictional character. There are some real personalities. So I had Pliny the Elder, the actual admiral of the Roman fleet and famous author of the natural history, as a character in it. And we don't have huge amounts of information on what he was like as a personality. Pliny the Younger talks about him a bit. Daisy Dunn wrote a fabulous book called In the Shadow of Vesuvius, which is like a joint biography of the two men. So I kind of drew his character from he has a very strong and particular voice in the natural history. It's actually sometimes he can be quite sort of pompous, but a lot of the time he's just wonderfully reflective and thoughtful. And so that side of him I tried to draw out in the book. Other characters, like there was a landlord called Sitius at one of the bars opposite the brothel, so I stuck him in the book. But he's not a main character. The main barman was completely invented. Mainly I just used total artistic license in creating the characters. But I did try and base it somewhat on what their experiences were likely to have been. So, for instance, the pimp, Felix, although he's a villain, I didn't want him to be a kind of cardboard cutout villain. So he's multifaceted. He had a very difficult life. He was enslaved originally as well. So it's also how people perpetuate quite an abusive system. They've often, gone through it themselves. It hasn't made them more sympathetic to people who are now at the bottom.
They just know the system better than the people controlling it. Yeah,
and they've managed to get to a certain point. And and book 2, without giving too many spoilers, is more about, it's very easy to be sympathetic towards a main character who's struggling to get her freedom, right? I mean, we all want her to win that, and we can all relate to that. But then once you're in the system, to what extent do you then become complicit? Do you own other enslaved people? How do you treat them? How does that work?
I really want to know. So we've talked about and yes, it is historical fiction. You mentioned having to mash 2 unlikely events together. Are there any points that gave you a headache? Were there any problems that you encountered?
Yeah, there were. And I must admit, whenever that happened, like the mashing together of a brothel slave becoming kind of going to parties, it's not impossible, but probably...
I still find myself having, when I do this with because I do some World War I fiction, still have this existential crisis that I know deep down in my heart that couldn't have happened. Or that he wouldn't have got 4 aeroplanes so he could get from Cairo to London in a day. But it is physically possible, so it's okay to do it. But, and it's just I spend a week pulling my hair out over it and going, can I, can't I? And I'm just do it. It's fiction, for God's sake.
That's it. I think that's what you have to do in the end, and I've spoke to a historian friend about it, and he was just like, the plot always wins. As long as it's plausible to the reader, and it's not, utterly fantastical, I think it's fine. You're kind of, what I really wanted was for the book overall to reflect something true about life at that period, and to have a grounding in the real site, the artifacts, the research. But after that, I think you do have to, you have to be led by the plot, because it isn't a history book, it's a novel. There's a graveyard scene in the necropolis where initially I just couldn't write it, because I was like, the necropolis would not have been set out this way, and it's not very likely. But in the end, and you take some details of what the necropolis would genuinely have been like, but then fling in some other invented stuff. But you have to tell a good story at the end of the day.
At one point, you just have to get over yourself, don't you?
I think so.
That's what the author's notes at the end are for.
Yeah, I made extensive use of those in the last fiction book. Yeah, okay. This is where I admit everything that's crap in the book.
So, I suppose this is going to be a really mean question. Who's your favourite character?
Well, I mean, Amara is my favourite character. But as I hope she's the most interesting character in there. I tried to make her neither, she's sympathetic, but she's a real survivor. So she's quite ruthless as well. And she has to do certain things to survive, and she has to make some very difficult choices, which she does. But aside from Amara, I think, your favourite characters as a writer are different from who your favourite characters would be as a person. So her best friend Dido is probably the nicest character in the book. But, aside from Amara, I really like Felix, the villain. because I found him interesting. I wanted to go beyond kind of just looking at the fact women were oppressed and had a very difficult time, and we haven't looked at this period so much from their point of view, to also trying to look at the men slightly differently too, the ways in which they also suffered from this particular type of system. So I guess Felix is a product of that, the choices he's made to become abusive, and their relationship was probably one of my favorite things to write, because they have many similarities, Felix and Amara. And if she had been a man, one wonders, would she have become Felix? So, and she has to become a bit more like him as the book progresses. And it's a bit of it's a real love-hate relationship that they have.
This is an Alina question, because she is obsessed with Pompeii. She would like to know, did you discover any new source material that would change the way we look at Pompeii? I think this is more in hope than expectation.
No, I definitely didn't. I wish I could say yes.
Is there anything you found because you must have had a reasonably good understanding or an interest in Pompeii to want to write a historical trilogy set there. Was there anything that changed your perception of it once you started doing like the deeper research?
I think the extent of the graffiti, the way people used it, almost to sort of message each other, an informal messaging service.
It's like texting, isn't it?
It is like texting, or sexting often as well.
I think what was Mary Beard's favourite one is there's like a pun on the I fucked here, I think someone's written on the wall, I fucked you owed here, or something like that. It's her favourite one.
Plenty of that.
Yeah. Yeah, she's on episode 9. That's a lot of episodes ago, but that was like, she still finds that one very funny.
A lot of them are very funny, or the way that people sort of answered each other back. So there's one where someone's put, lovers like bees live a honeyed life, and somebody else is stuck underneath, I wish. So the humour's great. But I have to be honest, the thing that shocked me the most, well, shocked maybe not, but was a bit surprising, was the number of penises everywhere.
Yeah, this is another of Alina's fixations, is the museum in Naples with the penis room from Pompeii.
Well, but they were everywhere, they were like part of the lamp. You might have a lamp, which is, they had lots of, what can you call them? Lots of cock lamps. You've got them like engraved on the road. You've got them painted on the walls. Yeah. They're all over the place.
Sophie Hay did explain why, and it is like a cultural thing. It's like a luck thing, even.
But it is, but actually, I'm a bit more with Mary Beard here. That yes, possibly a good luck thing, and also warding off the evil eye and all of that.
Yeah.
They are also.
It also is just a human propensity. If you,
I'm not
a bit of wall and a pen to just draw a cock, isn't there?
But also it's a kind of quite an aggressive thing to do. It's quite sort of emblematic of a very male-dominated society where male pleasure is a thing. I'm not saying it's like the dick pics of Pompeii, but it kind of is. And there is some evidence in some of the literature that this wasn't always comfortable for women. So Marshall talks about a well-bred girl, the poet Marshall, holding her hands in front of her face to avoid looking at a Priapus. So I don't know. I think they both are, as exactly as Sophie Hay says, they are this kind of good luck charm. They are kind of non-sexual, but then they also are sexual as well. Mm. So that's quite alien for us too, I think, to think about that.
I've often thought, is it partly due to what you mentioned earlier, that lack of agency over your own body?
Yes, I think
for so much that you're just trying to throw something out there that's probably the best. But you know what I mean? That's just trying to take some little bit of semblance of control.
What, the men that would do that,
or anyone, because it's just that knowing that those in charge and those with power, generally male, and generally putting their bits where other people may not want them. Maybe it was just that trying to throw it back. I have no evidence for this. I've just find that.
It's possible. There's a fresco of a guy with 2 penises in the brothel, for instance, and it's like, was this a slightly menacing thing for customers? Is it a kind of behave yourself, or because Priapus could be like guarding a garden? It's both it's both a boast and a threat to other men, I think. So I see what you're saying. I mean, I think it is both kind of look at my dick, really, but also, just the possibility that might be threatening to other men as well as a brag, I guess.
It's one of those frustrating things, like with the thumbs up or the thumbs down, which meant which in the comments, isn't it? That we will never know because we can't ask them.
No, and some of it might have been a joke as well. I mean, I can't believe some of these lamps weren't a joke. I mean, they're so gross.
Yeah, absolutely.
They bought in the gift shop.
Yeah, this is like a souvenir from a sex museum, like when people go to Amsterdam and you go anywhere where you can find a sex museum. Elodie, we've got waylaid into the weeds talking about cock, which is unfortunately not rare on History Hack, but we need to tell everybody the book is out, The Wolf Den. It's out very soon, and we want everyone to go and buy it. So tell everybody where they can get it, and tell them about the timeline for the rest of them and where you plan to go.
So The Wolf Den is really an adventure story about Amara, who starts off enslaved in a brothel and is determined to have a better life. Mm-hmm. So it's a journey right through Pompeii society on her quest for her freedom, and her long-time feud and her long-time loves that start off in book one. It's very much not about the volcano erupting, this trilogy.
I know, but you did mention the 70s, and I was like, oh, is that going to be like book 3?
Well, yeah, without giving too much away, it's likely that something might happen in book 3. But it's very much not a volcano-dominated trilogy. This is very much about life in Pompeii and one woman's life in particular. There's a special edition in Waterstones, which has some non-fiction stuff written by me about the real brothel and the real women. So that's a nice place to pick up a copy, or you can order it anywhere, pre-order it anywhere in online. It's out May the 13th.
And Matt, you'll put it on our bookshop page.
I have literally just done that now. So where does the title The Wolf Den come from, Elodie? Because it seems like it's very specific to something.
It is very specific. So the Latin word lupana means both brothel and wolf den. So basically the book is called The Brothel, but for Romans it had the two meanings, so the wolf den or the brothel. And the name for a prostitute, a lupa, was both she-wolf and prostitute. So I just felt it was a very evocative title because, wolves sound quite predatory. They've got a bit of an edge, but of course the women themselves were also kind of the prey, really. And just on a little nerd tangent, it's, I think, really fascinating that you've got Romulus and Remus suckled by a lupa as the symbol of Rome. And in some myths, she is, in fact, perhaps a prostitute. So this combination of the idea of wolves, wolf den, brothels, prostitutes, this is very much from the Latin language in the ancient world.
Outstanding. So you can go straight through History Hack to buy it, and then not only will Elodie get lots of sales and lots of attention like the book deserves, but History Hack will get paid too. So yay!
Hurrah all round.
Elodie, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait. I've been nagging Alina about sending. I want to get the Waterstones one with the factual stuff. I know she's had it because she did the questions and prepped it. So I'm like, send me the damn book. I need to see it too. So she's out walking the dogs. She's not impressed. Later. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Really nice to meet you both.
Don't forget that we do exist on Patreon as History Hack and on Patreon as well, which is Podbean's own version. Alina and I have had massive fun doing this in 2020, but life's going to change quite a lot next year and we're going to actually have to go and earn a living, etc. If we want to keep up the regularity that we've been bringing you and the kind of guests that we've been bringing you and the workload, then we will need your help. So if you join, there's going to be incentives for joining on either of those platforms. We're revamping ourselves on both of them. So don't forget to go in. You can do as little as $1 a month, and it all goes towards keeping up History Hack as regular as we've been able to bring it to you this year.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org. where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/hack history, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great